The wine goblet trembled, just slightly, in Jane's hand. 7 months she had waited for this exact night. The guards doubled at the outer gates, but thin as parchment along the private wing, because the Alpha King himself had ordered a smaller watch so he could grieve undisturbed. Tonight marked 18 years since his father's death, 18 years since old King Aldrich had been found cold in his bed, his passing quietly called natural by healers too frightened to say otherwise. Geoffrey always drank harder on this night than any other, and drink made even an Alpha's guard slower to wake. She had poisoned his wolf's senses steadily for weeks now, drop by careful drop, enough to dull the animal beneath his skin without ever alerting the man riding on top of it. Tonight, for the first time in 7 months, Geoffrey slept like something merely mortal. Jane set the empty goblet down without a sound and crossed the chamber on feet that had learned silence before they had learned much else. The knife came free from the sheath strapped along her forearm, small, curved, made for exactly this kind of work, and she let herself stand over him for one single breath, the way Silas had always told her to. "Let the moment settle before you take it," he used to say. "A blade struck in panic is a blade that misses." Geoffrey did not look like a monster in sleep. That had unsettled her from the very first week she'd served him, and it unsettled her now, the ordinary furrow between his brows, as if even unconscious some worry followed him down. She thought of her mother's laugh cut short by fire. She thought of 18 years of Silas's hand steady on her shoulder, telling her soon, soon when you're ready, and thought, finally, that she was. The blade dropped toward his throat. His hand caught her wrist before the metal ever touched skin. Jane didn't have time to gasp before she was airborne, the world tilting hard as Geoffrey rolled and pinned her beneath him, his golden eyes wide open and burning, not with the fog of sleep, but with the sharp clarity of a man who had been waiting. Waiting, she understood with a cold drop in her stomach, for exactly this. "I wondered," he said, low and rough, "how long you'd make me wait, Jane." She twisted, drove her knee up, nearly broke free, but he was an alpha, and even weakened, even poisoned for weeks, by her own careful hand, he was still faster than any man had a right to be. They crashed together into the small table by his bed, sent a lamp shattering to the floor, and Jane felt real fear for the first time in longer than she could remember, because this was not supposed to happen. Silas had trained her for this exact night for 18 years. She was not supposed to fail. The door slammed open. Torchlight flooded gold across the wreckage of the chamber, across Jane pinned beneath the Alpha King with a blade still clutched uselessly in her fist, and a guard's voice cracked through the room in alarm. "Your Majesty!" For one endless second, nothing moved. Jane's heart hammered so loud she was certain the guard could hear it from the doorway. This was the moment. This was where the chains came out, where she'd be dragged to the dungeons to await a slow and public death, where 18 years of purpose ended in an ordinary cell. Geoffrey didn't move off her. He didn't even look at the guard right away. When he finally did, his voice came out even, almost bored, as if nothing in the room were out of place at all. "I'm teaching Jane how to defend herself," he said. "Close the door on your way out." The guard hesitated, clearly seeing the shattered lamp, the overturned table, the knife still gleaming in her hand. But a king's word was a king's word, and he bowed low and backed out, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft, final click. Jane stared up at Geoffrey, breath ragged, mind roaring with a single unanswerable question. Why hadn't he called for her death? To understand how Jane came to be pinned beneath the very king she'd sworn to kill, you would need to go back 18 years, to the smell of smoke and the sound of her own screaming. She had been 7. Her mother, Alira, had been sick for over a month. A wasting fever the village healers swore would pass if she drank the right herbs, boiled fresh each morning and given at dusk. Jane had been the one to fetch them, small and quick and trusted with the task, because her mother had no one else. She remembered the particular weight of the herb satchel against her hip, the dirt road that turned to mud after rain, the herb woman in the village who always slipped her an extra sprig of mint because she said Jane had her mother's patient eyes. She remembered turning the last bend toward home and finding the cottage already swallowed in flame. She had thrown the herbs into the road without thinking and ran, screaming her mother's name into smoke that stung her throat raw, until a hand closed around her arm and yanked her back from the heat before it could take her too. "She's gone, child," the man had said, holding her against his chest as she thrashed and wailed. "There's nothing you can do for her now." "She was getting better," Jane had sobbed into his coat. "She was already better. I was helping her. I know." His voice had been so gentle, so certain, that something in her small, shattered heart had latched onto it like a drowning thing to driftwood. "I know, little one, and I promise you, I will find who did this." His name was Silas, a councilman of some standing, though Jane hadn't known that yet, only that he smelled of pipe smoke and parchment, and had eyes that looked at her like she mattered. He took her to his estate that very night, and in the years that followed he never once let her feel unwanted. He fed her, clothed her, sat with her through nightmares that left her too afraid to sleep, staying at her bedside until her breathing evened out, telling her stories about brave girls and old legends who grew up to right the wrongs done to them. He loved her, or at least she had never once doubted that he did. It was 2 years after the fire, when Jane was 9, that Silas finally told her what his investigation had uncovered. He'd sat her down in his study, his face grave, candlelight throwing long shadows across the shelves of books she wasn't yet old enough to read, and told her that her mother had once worked within the Alpha King's own court, which Jane vaguely remembered, fragments of her mother humming palace songs while she worked, the particular way she'd sometimes gone quiet and distant in the evenings, as if carrying something too heavy to set down. Silas told her that Alira had learned something there, a secret, something that could destroy the crown. "Your mother was killed," Silas told her, "on the old king's order," silenced before she could speak. Jane had been 9 years old, grieving, and utterly without reason to doubt the only father she had left. The rage that settled into her small chest that night never fully left it again. She remembered asking him, in a small voice, whether it would ever stop hurting. He'd knelt in front of her, taken both her hands in his, and told her that some hurts didn't stop, they only found somewhere useful to go. By 11, she was training with knives too large for her hands, her palms blistered and bleeding by the end of each session, and Silas would bandage them himself each night, murmuring that pain was simply the shape discipline took before it became strength. By 15, poisons and pressure points, and the particular art of walking a corridor without a single footstep announcing itself, she learned to move along the very edge of floorboards, to breathe in rhythm with her steps, to become, in Silas's words, a shadow with a purpose. By 17, she'd learned to read a room the way other girls read novels, cataloging exits and weaknesses, and the precise moment a man's guard dropped low enough to strike. Silas was patient, thorough, and endlessly kind in the moments between lessons, praising her, holding her when the bruises from training ached, telling her again and again that everything was in service of the day she would finally have justice. He hosted small dinners where he introduced her as his niece, let her sit at his right hand during council correspondence, taught her to argue politics and diplomacy alongside blade work, so that she grew into a woman who could kill a man in a corridor and charm his widow at the funeral without missing a step in either performance. "I would never ask you to do what was wrong," he told her once, when she was 19, and had hesitated over a task that troubled her conscience, a merchant's ledger she'd been sent to steal, though she never learned why, only that the man disappeared from the capital soon after. "Everything I ask of you protects this kingdom, Jane, protects people from becoming what you became. Trust me the way you did when you were 7. She always did. There had been moments, scattered and easy to bury, when doubt flickered at the edges of her certainty. A mission where the target turned out to be a frightened clerk rather than the traitor Silas described. A night she'd wept afterward, and Silas had simply held her and reminded her that mercy for one could mean ruin for thousands. Each time, his explanation arrived smoother and more convincing than her doubt, and each time she let it settle her, because the alternative, that the only father she had left might be lying to her, was a thought too large and too frightening to hold. By 25, Jane was beautiful in the particular unremarkable way that made her forgettable in a crowd and devastating up close, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued when she chose to be, capable of reading a man's intentions in a single unguarded glance. She had done work for Silas she did not always understand, missions in border towns and along trade roads that he explained away as necessary sacrifices, and she had never once questioned him past the first flicker of doubt, because he had never given her reason to. He was her father in every way that mattered. His purpose was her purpose. And so when Silas finally told her, in the quiet of a candlelit study, that she was ready, that the previous king had died, and his son Geoffrey now sat the throne, and that Geoffrey's father had been the one to order her mother burned, Jane had felt something in her settle into place, like the final piece of a puzzle, 18 years unfinished. "You will not go in with a blade first," Silas told her, tapping the map of the palace grounds spread across his desk, his finger tracing the private wing with the practiced ease of a man who had studied it far longer than Jane realized. "You will go in as nothing, as no one, and when the moment comes, no one will even remember your face." She dressed the part of a beggar the way she'd once dressed the part of a grieving child, completely, without a single false note. She rubbed dirt into the creases of her palms, let her hair fall matted and unwashed, practiced the particular stoop of someone who had gone hungry longer than was safe. She approached the palace gates in rags gone soft with dirt, was chased off twice by guards who threatened her with the flat of a pike, and returned a third time exactly when the head matron, a soft-hearted woman named Bettina, was due to pass through on her way to the market. Jane had watched Bettina's routine for a week before that morning, memorized the particular hour she left through the postern gate, the way she always paused to give coin to the same blind fiddler on the corner. She knew precisely which stall the woman favored, precisely how long her pity lasted before it turned to action. "Please," Jane whispered, letting her voice crack in a way that was only half performance. "Just something to eat. I'll work for it. I swear I will." Bettina had taken one look at her hollow cheeks and soft, pleading eyes, and sighed the way kind women the world over sighed when confronted with a hungry child grown into a hungry woman. "Come along then," she'd said, waving off the guard who moved to intervene. "Kitchens first. We'll see what work suits you." Jane worked the lower quarters for 6 months, and she worked them harder than anyone else. She scrubbed floors before dawn, her knees bruised and raw against cold stone, offered to finish other maids' chores when her own were done, learned every servant's name and every servant's small griefs and small joys, old Ferris's bad hip, young Coraline's sweetheart in the stable yard, the head cook's long-standing feud with the wine steward. She made herself so quietly, thoroughly beloved that when she finally asked, carefully, casually, over shared bread in the servants' hall, what it took to be chosen to serve the king himself, 3 different maids fell over themselves to help her. "You'd have to catch the steward's eye," one told her, leaning close over her mending. "He likes girls who don't gossip and don't flinch." "Practice not flinching then," said another, laughing, not knowing how unnecessary the advice truly was. Jane had stopped flinching at anything years before she ever set foot in this palace. She let them believe she was simply ambitious, hungry for a better post and better wages, and never once let them see the calculation beneath her smile. When Coraline whispered that serving the king directly meant favors could be asked of her later, Jane had only smiled and said she hoped to be worthy of such trust, and meant, privately, something entirely different by it. It was Bettina herself, in the end, who recommended her. "She's the hardest worker I've had in years, and steady besides. And so it was that 7 months after arriving at the palace gates as a starving stranger, Jane found herself standing outside the Alpha King's private chamber for the first time, a tray of food balanced in her hands, and her heart beating with a calm, cold certainty that felt almost like peace. She did not know, stepping through that door, that the man waiting inside would be the hardest target she had ever faced, not because of his wolf, though it was massive and white and legendary among the border lords, said to have once torn through an entire raiding party single-handed, but because of the way his gold eyes lifted to hers the instant she entered and did not look away. "What's your name?" he asked, before she'd even set the tray down. "Jane, Your Majesty." He studied her far longer than the question warranted, his gaze moving over her the way she imagined he might study a battlefield report, searching for the detail that didn't fit. "You didn't flinch when you walked in." "I'm usually quite composed, Your Majesty. New surroundings simply require a moment to settle." The lie came smooth and practiced, the way all her lies did. He didn't argue the point, but she felt his eyes on her the whole time she worked, cataloging something she couldn't name and didn't like being cataloged. It became a pattern over the following weeks, Geoffrey watching her with a quiet, unsettling attentiveness, as if he were slowly assembling a picture of her one glance at a time. He noticed the way she straightened a stack of correspondence without being asked, the way her eyes swept a room and lingered a half-second too long on the exits, the way she never once startled at the low rumble of his wolf beneath his voice when he was angry, though every other servant in the household went pale and still at the sound. Once he caught her gaze lingering too long over a report left open on his desk, her eyes moving across the lines, faster than idle curiosity would explain. "Can you read?" he asked, surprised. "Yes, Your Majesty. Most servants can't." "Who taught you?" "My mother," Jane said, and for one unguarded moment, the old grief rose in her throat before she could smother it. Something in his face softened, just slightly. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." Jane said nothing. She could not yet decide whether she hated him more or less for saying it kindly. There were other small moments she filed away without meaning to. The evening she found him standing alone at the window, with his jaw tight and his hands braced against the sill, staring out at nothing until he noticed her and quickly composed himself. The way he sometimes murmured a name under his breath that wasn't hers, wasn't anyone's she recognized, before catching himself and falling silent. She told herself these things meant nothing. Kings had their private griefs same as anyone, and it changed nothing about what he represented, what his crown had cost her. It was in the 2nd month of her service that she began slipping drops of a numbing tincture into his wine each evening, nothing that would kill, nothing that would even be noticed, only enough to slow the wolf beneath his skin, to dull the unnerving awareness that always seemed to track her movements, like he could read her thoughts through her spine. She measured the drops with the same care she'd once measured her mother's fever herbs, a strange and unwelcome echo she refused to examine too closely. She reported her progress faithfully to Silas's man, a guard stationed within the king's own household, careful and precise in every detail she passed along, careful never to let her voice carry more feeling than the report required. And for 6 months she watched Geoffrey drink that poisoned wine each night and lament, to no one in particular, how the nobles circled his good intentions like wolves of their own, how every reform he tried to pass was gutted before it reached the border villages, how he suspected treachery closer to the throne than he dared say aloud, how the crown felt some nights like a weight slowly crushing the life from his chest. She listened to him speak of villages he'd tried to rebuild only to have the funds vanish somewhere between the treasury and the road, of peace talks that collapsed at the last moment for reasons no one could quite explain, of a council that smiled to his face and worked against him the moment his back was turned. She told herself, again and again, that it changed nothing, that pity was not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness was not something she owed the son of the man who had burned her mother alive. But some nights, watching him drink himself toward sleep with his shoulders bowed under a weight she was helping to poison him into carrying, Jane found the hatred harder to hold on to than it used to be. She would return to her narrow servant's cot afterward and lie awake, turning the feeling over like a stone in her palm, unable to name it, unwilling to let it be what it resembled most. It was on the 7th month, on the anniversary of his father's uncovered death, that she finally judged him weak enough and finally raised the blade she had trained 18 years to raise, which brought her, breathless and pinned beneath him with the wreckage of a shattered lamp scattered across the floor and a guard's footsteps fading down the corridor, right back to the question she could not answer. Geoffrey released her wrist slowly, though he did not move his weight off her, and searched her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You've been poisoning my wine for weeks," he said. It wasn't a question. Slowly, carefully, enough to dull my wolf's senses without ever tipping into something I'd taste. Jane's blood went cold. "I don't know what you—" "Don't." His voice cut through her denial like a blade of its own. "I've known for over a month, Jane. I let it happen." Her mind raced through every possibility and found none of them made sense. A king who knew his own poisoning and said nothing. A king who caught a maid's blade at his throat and, instead of calling for the executioner, dismissed his own guard with a lie. "Why?" she breathed, the single word carrying 18 years of purpose suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. "Didn't you kill me the moment you caught my wrist?" Geoffrey's gold eyes held hers in the dark, and when he finally answered, his voice was quiet enough that she had to strain to catch every word. "Because I want to know," he said, "exactly who taught you to hate me enough to try." He rose from over her at last, crossed to the small table where 2 goblets sat untouched, and poured a fresh measure of wine into each. Unpoisoned, she realized with a jolt, drawn from a sealed decanter she'd never touched. He held one out to her. "Starting tomorrow," he said, "you're going to read me every report that crosses my desk. Every single one. Consider it your punishment, for now." Jane stared at the offered goblet, at the knife still loose in her own hand, that he had made no move to take from her, and felt the first true crack split open in 18 years of certainty. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Geoffrey's smile held no warmth at all, and yet somehow no cruelty either, only the terrible patience of a man who had been waiting far longer than one poisoned season for the truth to walk into his chamber on its own 2 feet. "You won't," he said, "because you're far too curious now to walk away without learning why I let you live." He was right, and that terrified her more than the blade ever had. Jane did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot long after the guard's footsteps had faded, and the castle settled into its uneasy quiet, turning Geoffrey's words over and over like a stone she couldn't stop worrying with her thumb. "You're far too curious now to walk away." He had said it like a challenge, like he already knew something about her she hadn't yet admitted to herself. She hated that he was right. 18 years of purpose had just been handed a single loose thread, and some traitorous part of her wanted, more than anything, to pull it. By morning, she had composed herself into something resembling calm, though her hands weren't quite steady as she dressed. She half expected guards at her door, chains, a summons to the dungeons dressed up as Mercy the night before, and revoked with the dawn. Instead, there was only Bettina, bustling past with an armful of linens, telling her the king wanted his morning correspondence brought up early today. Geoffrey's chamber, in daylight, looked nothing like the battlefield it had been the night before. The shattered lamp was gone. The table had been righted. Only a faint scorch mark on the rug near the hearth remained as evidence that anything unusual had happened at all, and Jane found herself wondering, with a chill, how many servants had been paid or threatened into silence to make it disappear so completely. Geoffrey sat behind his desk, a stack of reports already waiting, and did not look up when she entered. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him without ceremony, as though she were a clerk he'd employed for years, rather than a woman who had tried to open his throat 12 hours prior. "Read." Jane sat. Her hands, she noted distantly, had finally stopped shaking. The first report was mundane, a dispute over grazing rights along the eastern border, two shepherd families quarreling over a stretch of hillside that had apparently changed hands 3 times in as many generations. She read it aloud in a flat, even voice, expecting nothing, and was startled when Jeffrey interrupted before she'd finished the second paragraph. "That land belonged to the Hollis family for 60 years, he said, until my father redrew the boundary to favor a lord who'd loaned him money he never intended to repay. I've been trying to correct it for 3 years. Every time I do, someone on the council finds a legal technicality to delay it another season." Jane glanced up. "Why does it matter to you? It's a hillside." "It matters," Jeffrey said, "because the Hollis family has sent me the same petition every autumn for 3 years, and every autumn I've had to write back that I'm still looking into it." His jaw tightened. A king who cannot fix a hillside dispute in 3 years is not a king people trust to fix anything larger. Jane said nothing, but she filed the exchange away with the same careful attention she'd once given to memorizing a guard's rotation. It went on like that for days, then weeks. Each evening she read, and each evening Jeffrey explained, patiently, sometimes bitterly, always with a precision that suggested he'd turned each failure over in his mind 1,000 times before she ever arrived with the paper in hand. A trade agreement with the Western clans, stalled for the 4th time because the council kept insisting on additional levies that made the clans walk away from the table. A garrison requesting reinforcement against raiders that never seemed to arrive in time, though the orders had been signed and dispatched weeks prior. A widow's compensation claim, approved by Jeffrey's own hand, that had somehow never reached her at all. "Someone is undoing your orders," Jane said one evening, several weeks into her strange new punishment, before she could stop herself. Jeffrey's eyes lifted to hers, sharp with something that looked almost like relief at being understood. "Yes," he said simply, "I've suspected it for years. I simply haven't been able to prove who or how far it reaches." She should have felt nothing at that. It was not her concern. His crown, his council, his slow unraveling kingdom were not hers to mourn or repair. And yet some small, unfamiliar seed of sympathy had lodged itself in her chest, and no amount of reminding herself of her mother's screams could quite dislodge it. It was during the 5th week of reading reports that she came across one that made her blood run cold. The parchment was official, stamped with the seal of the Border Patrol, a report on 2 envoys, dispatched months prior to negotiate a peace agreement with a rival pack, found dead along the trade road before they'd ever reached their destination. The report noted, in careful bureaucratic language, that 2 assassins had since been captured and executed for the crime, their motives never fully determined, the matter considered closed. Jane's voice did not waver as she read it aloud. It could not afford to waver, because she remembered that road. She remembered the particular curve where the trees grew close enough to block the moonlight, remembered the weight of her blade sliding free, remembered Silas's instructions relayed through his guard with the same calm certainty he always used. "These men mean to broker a peace that will weaken our position for a generation. It cannot be allowed to happen." She had killed those envoys herself, and 2 other men she had never met, whose faces she would never know, had been executed in her place. Jane. She looked up. Jeffrey was watching her with the same unnerving attentiveness he'd shown that first night, his gaze moving over her face like he could read the exact shape of the thought currently tearing through her. "You went pale," he said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." The word came out steadier than she felt. "It's a difficult report to read. 2 men are dead." He studied her a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, but he let it pass, and something about the fact that he let it pass, that he did not press her further despite the suspicion plain on his face, unsettled her more than if he had. That night, for the first time since she'd begun her mission 7 months prior, she delayed her report to Silas's guard. She told herself it was simple caution, that she had nothing new worth passing along, but she lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling of her small quarters, turning the dead envoys over in her mind, like stones she could not put back down. The doubt, once seated, grew faster than she wanted it to. She began noticing things she had trained herself, for 18 years, not to notice, the way certain reports Jeffrey explained to her lined up, with uncomfortable precision, against missions Silas had sent her on. A trade caravan robbed of its goods along a road she had once scouted for an ambush she'd been told was necessary to weaken a corrupt merchant guild. A minor lord's sudden, unexplained illness that had conveniently removed him from a vote he'd been expected to win. A fire at a grain storehouse that Silas had called an accident, and Jeffrey's report called, plainly, arson. Each evening she read, and each evening the picture assembling itself in her mind grew clearer and more unbearable, until she could no longer tell herself she was simply imagining connections that weren't there. Jeffrey watched her closely throughout all of it. She could feel his attention like a hand at the back of her neck, though he asked no more questions, pressed no further than that single unanswered moment over the envoy report. She wondered, sometimes, if he already suspected the shape of the truth and was simply waiting, with the same patience Silas had once used to shape her, for her to arrive at it herself. It was nearly 2 months into her strange penance when she finally asked for permission to leave the palace grounds. "For what purpose?" Jeffrey asked, not looking up from the letter he was sealing. "Personal matters, Your Majesty. I won't be long." He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she was certain he would refuse, certain he somehow knew exactly where she intended to go and why, and then, to her genuine surprise, he simply nodded. "Take the day," he said. "The guards at the gate will know to expect your return." She should have found it suspicious. A king granting an admitted poisoner and would-be assassin unsupervised leave from his own castle was either recklessness or a trap so carefully laid she couldn't yet see its edges. But she took the leave regardless, because she needed, more than she could admit even to herself, to see the truth of the reports with her own eyes. The grain storehouse was the first stop. She found it exactly as the report had described, burned to its foundation, the surrounding village still gutted and half rebuilt, families she spoke to under a false name still bitter over a harvest lost to a fire the local lord had quietly blamed on lightning. No lightning had struck that night, an old farmer told her, spitting into the dirt. There hadn't been a cloud in the sky. The Merchant Guild village was worse. The trade route Jeffrey's report described as disrupted had, in truth, collapsed an entire season's income for 3 villages along its length, and the corrupt guild leader Silas had once told her needed removing had simply been replaced by someone worse, someone who'd used the chaos of the ambush to seize control and had been squeezing the villages dry ever since. Jane stood in the ruins of a life she had helped destroy, believing the entire time she was serving justice, and felt something in her chest crack clean through. She did not go home that evening. She went, instead, to Silas. His study smelled exactly as she remembered, pipe smoke and old parchment, candlelight throwing long, familiar shadows across shelves of books he'd once read to her when she was small and frightened and grieving. He rose from behind his desk when she entered, his face breaking into the same warm smile he'd worn every day of her life since the fire. "Jane." He crossed the room and took her hands in his, the gesture so achingly familiar that some small, exhausted part of her wanted only to fall into it the way she had at 7 years old. "It's been too long. Tell me, how close are we?" "Close," she said, and the lie tasted like ash. Silas's eyes narrowed slightly, reading her the way he always had, though not quite deeply enough to catch what she was truly hiding. "You're troubled. Is he suspicious of you?" No, that much at least was true, though not in the way Silas meant. "I simply need more time. He's careful." "Time is not a luxury we have in abundance," Silas said, releasing her hands and turning back toward his desk, his voice carrying the faint edge of impatience she'd learned, over 18 years, to recognize and fear. "But I trust you. I have always trusted you, Jane. You have never once given me reason to doubt you. Is that why you're impatient now? She asked. Because I've never delayed before? He turned back, and for one unguarded moment something sharp and assessing flickered across his features before the warmth resettled over it like a mask sliding back into place. You've simply never faced a target this careful before, he said smoothly. Take the time you need. I know you won't fail me. She left before the conversation could go further, before he could read anything more in her face than she was willing to let him see, and walked back toward the palace in the gathering dark, with her mother's memory pressing hard against her ribs, and no clearer sense of what to do with it than when she'd arrived. Geoffrey was waiting when she returned, which surprised her more than it should have. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked, and something in his tone told her he already suspected far more than he was saying. Yes, Jane said quietly. He studied the weight she knew was written plainly across her face, and instead of pressing her, he crossed to the small table by the window and poured 2 goblets of wine, the same unpoisoned decanter he'd shown her weeks before. He held one out to her. She looked at the goblet, then at him, and something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't need poison to kill you, Jane, he said. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. Drink. She watched him drink first, out of 18 years of trained caution, rather than any real fear, and then drank her own. Tell me what happened to your mother, he said. Not a command this time, something gentler. And so, for the first time since the fire had taken everything from her, Jane told someone the whole truth of that day. The herbs, the healer's promise, the smoke rising over the cottage, the kind stranger who had pulled her back from the flames and promised her justice she had spent 18 years chasing. She did not mention Silas by name. She told herself it was caution. She suspected, somewhere beneath the caution, it was something closer to loyalty she couldn't yet bring herself to fully surrender. Geoffrey listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when she finished he said only, "Come with me," and led her out through a side door she hadn't known existed, down a narrow stair, into a small walled garden, lit by nothing but the moon and a scattering of late-blooming flowers. "This is where I come," he said, settling onto a stone bench worn smooth by years of use, when the crown becomes too heavy to carry standing up. They sat together in silence for a long while, and Jane felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not trust, not yet, but something adjacent to it, some fragile and unfamiliar ease she didn't know what to do with. It was 3 evenings later that Geoffrey came to their usual reading with something different in his hands. Not the crisp, fresh parchment of current council business, but an old, dust-covered file, its edges soft with age, tied with a faded ribbon that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. "What is this?" Jane asked, though something in her stomach had already gone tight and cold, some instinct sounding an alarm she couldn't yet name. "The investigation into your mother's cottage," Geoffrey said quietly. "I had it pulled from the archives 3 weeks ago. I wanted to be certain before I showed it to you." Jane's hands were not steady as she untied the ribbon. The report was old, the handwriting cramped and official, but the facts within it were plain enough that no amount of careful legal language could soften them. Her mother had indeed worked within the palace, years before the fire, a minor position among the kitchen staff, unremarkable in every way except that during her service she had overheard something she was never meant to hear. A conspiracy, the report called it, though the details of what exactly had been plotted were redacted, blacked out by some hand long since gone. What remained clear was this. Alira had written down what she'd overheard, in her own careful hand, and delivered the note directly to the Alpha King himself, not hidden it, not sold it, but handed it to the very throne Silas had spent 18 years insisting had ordered her murder. Those responsible for the plot, the report noted, had not known Alira could read or write. They had assumed her silence could be bought or frightened into permanence. When they learned otherwise, when they learned she had already spoken, already written, already handed the truth to the king who could act on it. They had poisoned her first, slowly, to be certain she said nothing further. And when the healers began to save her despite it, when her recovery threatened to let her speak again, they had burned the cottage to the ground to finish what the poison hadn't. Jane read every line twice, 3 times, her vision beginning to blur, the careful control she had built over 18 years cracking wider with every word. "Your father," she said slowly, forcing the words out past a throat gone tight as a fist, "died soon after this. Was it?" "Yes," Geoffrey said, watching her with an expression that held no triumph in it at all, only a grim, tired sympathy. "The healers called it old age. It wasn't." Jane set the report down with hands that would not stop shaking. Everything she had believed for 18 years, the crown's guilt, the king's order, the reason she had trained and killed and hated with every fiber of a life built entirely around vengeance, dissolved in the space of a single dusty file, and what remained in its place was a question so large and so terrible she could barely hold it in her mind. If the king had not ordered her mother's death, if her mother had, in fact, tried to warn the crown, had died protecting it rather than being destroyed by it, then who had spent 18 years convincing her otherwise? Who had taken a grieving 7-year-old girl and pointed her, like a blade, at exactly the wrong throat? She rose from her chair without a word and walked out of Geoffrey's chamber. He did not stop her. Silas's guard was waiting in her quarters when she returned, his expression tight with impatience in the flickering candlelight. "The king still breathes," he said, without preamble. "Silas grows impatient. He wants to know why." "Tell him I'm still working," Jane said, her voice flatter and colder than she intended, though the guard didn't seem to notice anything beyond the words themselves. "Time is against us," the guard pressed. "He won't wait much longer." Jane said nothing more, only fixed him with a look sharp enough that he retreated without further argument, and she spent the rest of that night sitting motionless on the edge of her cot, the dusty report's contents burning behind her eyes, unable to reconcile the father who had raised her with the man the ink on that page described. She did not yet know that her silence, her delay, her sudden and uncharacteristic hesitation had already reached Silas through channels she hadn't accounted for, that a man who had spent 18 years reading every flicker of her expression would not fail to notice the change in her now, however carefully she thought she'd hidden it. Nor did she know that Silas, ever cautious, ever thorough, had already decided to test the loyalty he suddenly, for the first time in 18 years, found himself doubting. 5 nights later, Jane woke to the sound of screaming. She was on her feet and moving before her mind had fully caught up with her body, blade drawn from beneath her pillow on pure instinct, the corridor outside her quarters already thick with the metallic scent of blood. She rounded the corner toward the private wing and found 2 of the king's guards sprawled across the stone floor, their throats opened with the kind of clean, practiced precision she recognized immediately, because it was precision she herself had been taught, blow for blow, by the very man who had trained her. The door to Geoffrey's chamber stood open, and past it she could see shapes moving in the dark, 5 of them, moving with the same silent efficiency she'd spent 18 years mastering, converging on a massive white shape that fought back with teeth and claw, and a snarl that shook the very walls. Jane's blood went cold with a horror that had nothing to do with fear for herself. She had never opened that door. She had refused, these past 5 days, every signal Silas's guard had pressed her to give. And still they were here. Still Geoffrey was fighting for his life, against 5 trained blades in the dark, which meant Silas had never truly needed her cooperation at all. He had only wanted to see whether she would give it. Without thinking, without weighing a single consequence, Jane raised her own blade and ran straight into the fight, the last certainty she had left in the world narrowing down to a single desperate thought. Not him. Not like this. The assassin nearest the door never saw Jane coming. She moved the way Silas had trained her, low, silent, blade leading, and opened his throat before he'd even registered another body in the room. The second turned at the sound of his companion falling and met her knife an instant too late. Jane felt no triumph in it, only a cold, focused clarity, the kind that came from finally, truly knowing which side of a fight she stood on. Geoffrey had already shifted. His wolf filled half the chamber, white fur slicked dark with blood at the shoulder where a blade had caught him, jaws closing around a third assassin's arm with a sound that made even Jane's stomach turn. He fought like something out of the old legends the border villages still told their children. Vicious, precise, utterly without mercy for men who had come to end his life in his sleep. Between the two of them, the 5 assassins fell in a matter of minutes. Jane stood over the last one as he crumpled, chest heaving, blade still dripping in her hand, and it was only then, in the sudden ringing silence of the aftermath, that she let herself look down at the dagger she'd wrenched from his failing grip. Her stomach dropped clean through the floor. She knew that dagger. She had held its twin 100 times in training, had felt its particular weight and balance so many times it might as well have been an extension of her own hand. It was Silas's make, forged in the same smithy, marked with the same near-invisible etching along the hilt that only someone trained in his household would recognize. Geoffrey shifted back to himself, breathing hard, blood running freely from the gash at his shoulder, and his gold eyes found hers across the wreckage of dead men and shattered furniture. "You recognize them," he said. It wasn't a question. Jane's hand tightened around the dagger until her knuckles ached. "Yes," she said, and the word cost her more than any blade ever had. "Councilman Silas sent them." Something in Geoffrey's face did not change, exactly. No shock, no fury, nothing she might have expected from a man who'd just been named the target of his own counsel. Only a slow, grim nod, as if she had finally confirmed something he had suspected for a very long time and had simply been waiting, with terrible patience, for her to say aloud herself. Without a word, he crossed to the heavy iron safe set into the wall behind his desk, worked the lock with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling from the fight, and drew out a single folded note, its parchment yellowed and soft with age. "I didn't want to give you this," he said, "until I was certain I could trust you. I'm sorry it took blood on my floor to be certain." Jane unfolded it with fingers that felt distant, disconnected from the rest of her, and recognized the handwriting instantly, small, careful, achingly familiar, the same hand that had once written her name inside the cover of a battered storybook. Her mother's note, written in haste, the ink smudged where the pen had pressed too hard, describing a conversation overheard between Councilman Silas and 2 other lords she did not name outright, only described, a plot to see the king killed on his way to the annual temple gathering, the throne seized in the chaos that followed. "I believe I am being watched," the note ended. "If anything happens to me, know that I gave this to the only man I trusted to act on it." Jane read it 3 times, and each time the floor beneath her seemed to tilt a little further away. 18 years. 18 years of grief sharpened into purpose, of trust given so completely, and so young that she had never once thought to question the shape it had been carved into. And all of it, every single blade she had ever raised in her mother's name, had been raised at the direction of the very man who had murdered her. "He knew I trusted him completely," she said quietly, more to herself than to Geoffrey. "He's careful," Geoffrey said. "Careful enough that I don't know how many men in my own council answer to him. That's why I never moved against him directly. I needed proof I could trust, and men I could be certain weren't already his." Jane looked up at him, and for the first time in 7 months she asked the question plainly, without artifice, without calculation. "Why didn't you have me executed the moment your guard found us tangled on your floor?" "Because," Geoffrey said, "a woman capable of what you've survived, trained the way you've been trained, is either my greatest enemy or my greatest asset. I needed to know which. I still do." She asked to see Silas herself, and Geoffrey did not try to stop her, though she saw, plainly, how much it cost him to let her walk out that door alone. "He'll try to turn you again," Jeffrey warned, "the moment he sees doubt on your face." "I know," Jane said. "I still need to hear it from him." Silas's study looked exactly as it always had, warm and familiar, and lined with the same books he'd once read her to sleep with. And when he looked up from his desk, his face broke into the same affectionate smile it always had, as if 18 years of lies could simply be smoothed over with the same warmth that had built them in the first place. "Jane," he rose, reaching for her hands the way he always did. "You saved him." She did not take his hands. "You sent 5 men to kill him." Silas's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes went very still. "A test," he said simply. "I needed to know where your loyalty truly stood. And now you know." "Now I know," he agreed, and there was no shame in it at all, only a kind of weary acceptance, as if she had merely disappointed him in some small, forgivable way. "You're in love with him. It's made you weak. You don't get to decide which direction I point my sword," Jane said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You taught me that yourself." "I taught you a great many things," Silas said. "Apparently not enough of them stuck." Jane made herself ask the question she had come to ask, though every part of her still hoped, foolishly, for an answer that would let her keep some fragment of the father she'd believed in. "Did you set my mother's cottage on fire?" Silas's silence answered before he did. "She discovered your plot," Jane pressed, her voice rising despite herself. "She wrote it down. She gave it to the king. You poisoned her to keep her quiet, and when she started recovering anyway, you burned her alive, and then you pulled a grieving child out of the ashes and called yourself her savior." "I built something out of that grief," Silas said, and there was no denial in his voice, only a strange, terrible conviction. "I gave you purpose, direction, a reason to survive when you had nothing left. You gave me a lie." "I gave you a life," he snapped, the first real heat she'd heard from him in years. "Everything I've done, every sacrifice, every necessary loss, has been in service of a kingdom that deserves better than the rot sitting on that throne. You call it murder. I call it the cost of building something worth having." "The envoys," Jane said, "the grain storehouse, the trade routes, ordinary people who had nothing to do with your ambitions." "Necessary sacrifices," Silas said, and the phrase landed exactly as flat and monstrous as it deserved to. Jane felt something in her chest that had been holding steady for 18 years finally, completely give way. She had expected fury. She had expected the clean, simple satisfaction of finally understanding her enemy well enough to end him. Instead, she found only grief, vast and shapeless. Grief for the father she had loved, and the girl she had been, and the 18 years she could never get back. "Did you ever love me?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. "Was any of it real?" For the first time, something in Silas's composure cracked. "You were the daughter I always wanted," he said, and his voice, too, had gone unsteady. "I love you still, Jane. Everything else, the throne, the kingdom, all of it, none of it changes that." She wanted, desperately, to believe that love and betrayal could not occupy the same heart. She was old enough now, and had seen enough, to know they could. "You cannot tell him the truth," Silas said as she turned to leave, his voice sharpening with something closer to threat. "You'll burn alongside me if you do. He'll never love a woman who confesses to everything you've done." "I don't care anymore," Jane said, and meant it more fully than she had meant anything in years. The guards at his door moved to block her path, but Silas, watching her go with an expression she couldn't name, waved them aside without a word. She found Jeffrey exactly where she'd left him, and the moment she stepped through his door, the grief she'd been holding at bay finally broke over her completely. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. Jeffrey simply crossed the room and sat beside her in silence, making no move to touch her, no move to press her for anything at all, only staying close enough that she was not alone with it. When she finally spoke, the confession came out of her in pieces. The envoys she had killed with her own hands while two innocent men hung for it in her place. The storehouse fire, the trade routes she'd helped sabotage, believing every time that she was serving the kingdom rather than gutting it. She told him everything, every mission, every lie Silas had wrapped around her like armor, and finished with the one truth that frightened her most. Killing you, she said, was supposed to be the last piece. 18 years of training, all of it aimed at your throat. I know, Jeffrey said quietly. Arrest me, Jane said. I've earned it 100 times over. Jeffrey did not move. He sat beside her in the settling quiet, letting the full weight of what she'd confessed find its place. And when he finally spoke, his voice held none of the fury she'd braced herself for. Silas's men will come for you now, he said. You'll sleep here, under guard, until this is finished. What happens to you after? I'll decide once we've brought him to justice, not before. The next morning, Jane gave him everything she had. Names of Silas's contacts within the council, the signals used to pass messages unseen, the secret routes through the palace that generations of quiet corruption had carved beneath the notice of honest men. Within 2 days, Jeffrey had quietly begun removing compromised guards from his own household, replacing them with officers Jane herself identified as untouched by Silas's reach. Men and women she'd once studied for weakness, and now studied for loyalty instead. They seized records hidden in a false bottom drawer of a minor lord's study, catching one conspirator attempting to flee the capital in the dead of night with a satchel of stolen gold and a forged travel writ. Each discovery narrowed the net a little further, and Jane watched Silas's careful 18-year construction come apart thread by thread, feeling neither triumph nor sorrow so much as a grim, exhausted relief. Silas, sensing the walls finally closing around him, moved early. The coup came not with subtlety, but with open force. Armed men storming the throne room in broad daylight, Silas himself at their head for the first time in 18 years, without the mask of quiet civility, his face twisted with the particular fury of a man who had built an empire of patience only to watch it collapse in a matter of days. Jane fought at Jeffrey's side through the worst of it, blade for blade, the two of them moving with a coordination that surprised even her, until Silas himself stood alone at last, disarmed, surrounded by guards loyal to a throne he had spent half his life trying to topple. He looked at Jane across the wreckage of the throne room, blood on his coat and something almost like pride still flickering behind his eyes, and said nothing at all as they led him away in chains. The trial was held before the full council, the throne room packed with nobles and commoners alike who had waited 18 years to learn the truth behind a dead king and a burned cottage and a dozen quiet tragedies no one had ever properly explained. Jeffrey sat upon his throne and read the charges aloud himself, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, the murder of his father, dressed up for 18 years as an old man's natural passing, the poisoning and burning of Alira, a woman guilty of nothing but loyalty to her crown, the deaths of 2 envoys and the 2 innocent men executed in place of their true killer, and finally, the attempted murder of the reigning Alpha King himself, culminating in an armed coup against the throne. Silas stood before the assembled court in chains and offered no denial, only a defense delivered with the same maddening calm he'd used to raise Jane from a grieving child into a weapon. I sought only to rebuild a system bound to collapse under its own rot, he said, his voice steady even now. Then his gaze slid to Jane, standing at the edge of the dais, and something sharp and bitter entered his tone. You call me traitor, yet the woman beside your throne murdered your envoys with her own hands, poisoned your wolf for months, and entered your chamber with a blade meant for your throat. Why does she stand free while I am condemned? Because she has captured your heart? A murmur swept the hall. Jane felt every eye in the room settle on her at once, and did not look away. Jeffrey's expression did not change, though something in his voice, when he answered, carried an edge sharp enough to silence the murmuring instantly. "She will answer for what she's done," he said. "Every part of it. But you built her crimes with your own hands, Silas, out of a 7-year-old's grief, and used her for 18 years believing every blade she raised served justice. That is not the same as choosing evil with open eyes. Yours was." He ordered Silas and his surviving co-conspirators to execution before the week's end, and the sentence fell over the hall with the weight of 18 years finally fully settling. Then he turned to Jane. "You were 7 years old," Geoffrey said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "when Councilman Silas took your grief and sharpened it into a weapon. For that, you were his victim, and no court in this kingdom will condemn a child for what was done to her. But you were 25 when you carried that weapon into innocent lives believing yourself righteous. Your suffering explains your crimes. It does not return the dead to their families." Jane held his gaze and did not flinch, because she had long since stopped flinching from anything, least of all the truth. "5 years, Geoffrey said. "You will serve this crown in confinement, stripped of every weapon you carry, forbidden from any fight or mission unless I myself authorize it. You will visit every family harmed by Silas's network, and by your own hand. You will help dismantle what remains of his web of assassins. You will rebuild, piece by piece, everything you helped destroy, and you will do it without expectation of forgiveness, because forgiveness is not something a sentence can purchase." The council murmured its approval, and Jane bowed her head and accepted a punishment she knew, better than anyone in that hall, she had long since earned. The 5 years that followed tested her in ways 18 years of training never had. The first door that closed in her face belonged to a young widow whose husband had died an envoy on a road Jane herself had walked with a blade in hand. The woman took one look at her, understood exactly who stood on her threshold, and shut the door without a single word. Jane stood there a long moment in the cold, then turned and walked away, understanding for the first time that some wounds simply did not close, no matter how sincerely one knelt before them. She rebuilt a village whose peace agreement had collapsed the night she'd killed the envoys meant to secure it, working alongside its people for months, laying stone and thatch with her own hands until the treaty could finally be signed in truth rather than blood. She recognized in the crowd gathered for that signing the face of a child no older than 7, and learned only afterward that the girl's father had died because of a mission Jane had once carried out believing it served the greater good. She did not tell the child who she was. She simply made certain, quietly and without credit, that the family never wanted for anything again. A surviving member of Silas's old network found her once, in the 3rd year, in a quiet market town, murmuring an offer to join a new cause rising from the ashes of the old one. Jane turned him over to Geoffrey's guard without lifting a single blade, and felt, in that moment, something close to peace settle where fury used to live. She helped root out the last hidden threads of Silas's web, one careful thread at a time, until nothing remained of the empire he had spent a lifetime building. And in the 4th year, an old farmer whose grain storehouse had once burned on Silas's order finally looked her in the eye and thanked her, not because the fire was forgotten, he told her plainly, but because she had chosen, every single day for 4 years, to repair what she could of what could never be undone. Geoffrey came to her in the evenings sometimes, asking after her progress, listening without softening the weight of what she carried, never once shortening her sentence out of sentiment. She loved him more for that restraint than she ever could have for mercy she hadn't earned. By the end of the 5th year, Jane had learned the truth Silas never taught her. Atonement was not a bargain in which good deeds purchased the right to be loved again. It was simply the slow, unglamorous work of repairing what remained, and carrying, without complaint, what could never be repaired at all. Many who had suffered by her hand had forgiven her by then. Others never would. She had made her peace with both outcomes in equal measure. Geoffrey took her to the garden on the evening her sentence formally ended. the same small walled garden where he'd once told her this was where he came when the crown grew too heavy to carry standing. "For 5 years," he said, "I've waited to ask you something as a man, rather than command it as your king." Jane turned to face him fully, her heart beating with something entirely unlike the cold, calculating certainty she'd once carried into his chamber with a blade. "Be my mate," Geoffrey said, "not because I command it, not because either of us owes the other anything, only because I want you beside me, as my equal, for whatever years remain to either of us." Jane looked at the man who had spared her life when he had every right to end it, who had waited 5 years without once softening her punishment for the sake of his own feelings, who had shown her, patiently and without cruelty, that a crown could be carried with honor even by a man who'd inherited a kingdom built on someone else's lies. "On my own terms," she said, "as a free woman, not manipulated, not commanded, chosen. Always," Geoffrey said, "only ever chosen." She kissed him then, in the quiet of the garden where he had once let her grieve in silence, and felt 18 years of grief and rage finally, fully settle into something that no longer needed a blade to carry it. The mating ceremony was held before the entire kingdom, in the same throne room where Silas had once stood in chains and Jane had once knelt to receive her sentence. The golden light of the temple's high windows spilled across a hall packed with nobles and commoners, and the very families she had spent 5 years trying to repair, many of whom had come, of their own choosing, to stand witness. Geoffrey stood before the assembled court in the ceremonial robes of the ashen line, and when the final vows were spoken and the mark of the mating bond settled warm beneath Jane's skin, he did not simply take her hand and call her his queen. He turned to the crowd, lifted the crown from its cushion himself, and set it upon her head before the entire kingdom, his voice ringing clear across the silent hall. "A woman who was made a weapon by another's cruelty," he said, "and chose, every day for 5 years, to become something else instead. My people, your queen." The hall erupted into a roar of applause that shook the ancient stones, and Jane stood beneath the weight of a crown she had once meant to steal by killing the man now smiling at her side, and felt, for the first time in 18 years, entirely and completely whole. Thank you so much for staying with Jane and Geoffrey, from that first blade in the dark all the way to the crown. If this story found you at the right moment, drop a comment telling me which scene hit hardest, and subscribe for the next one, because there's always another throne, another secret, another girl learning her own strength. See you in the next story.